It was an unusually quiet night in Charlotte. The city's bustling energy had given way to the stillness of the early morning hours. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few night owls wandering about and the occasional car that sped through the sleeping neighborhoods. But at the corner of Trade Street and McDowell, something was brewing. Highline Motors, a luxury car dealership known for its sleek showrooms and exclusive clientele, stood like a fortress amidst the city's concrete jungle. The building was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a combination of glass and steel that reflected the city's lights like a prism. During the day, it was a symbol of wealth and status, its windows revealing the glistening treasures within: BMWs, Porsches, and other high-end vehicles that most people could only dream of owning. But tonight, Highline Motors would become the setting for a crime that would shock the city to its core. Three figures emerged from the shadows, their movements synchronized and purposeful. They were dressed in black from head to toe, their faces obscured by balaclavas. These weren't petty criminals looking for a quick score. They were professionals, their actions precise and deliberate. The leader, a tall man with a commanding presence, signaled to the others. They moved swiftly, one of them producing a small electronic device from his pocket. He approached the dealership's security panel and began working on it with the kind of expertise that suggested he had done this many times before. Within moments, the red light on the panel turned green, and the once impregnable doors of Highline Motors slid open with a soft hiss. The trio slipped inside, moving like shadows through the darkened showroom. The leader scanned the room, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as they settled on their targets. There, under the soft glow of the emergency lights, were the jewels of Highline Motors. A brand new $100,000 BMW, a sleek Mercedes-Benz S-Class, and a Porsche 911 that looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. "Get to work," the leader whispered, his voice barely audible, but filled with authority. The others sprang into action. One of them, a wiry man with quick hands, headed straight for the BMW. He produced a laptop and a set of tools from his backpack, plugging into the car's onboard computer system. The other, a stocky man with a powerful build, went to work on the Mercedes, using a similar setup. The leader stood watch, his eyes darting between the showroom and the entrance, always alert, always ready. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The tension in the air was palpable, but the thieves remained focused, their hands moving with the precision of surgeons. Then, almost simultaneously, the engines of the BMW and the Mercedes roared to life. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, a low growl that echoed through the empty dealership like a predator's purr. The leader allowed himself a small smile. "Move out," he commanded, his voice still barely above a whisper. The wiry man slid into the driver's seat of the BMW, while the stocky man took the wheel of the Mercedes. The leader made his way to the Porsche, pausing for a moment to admire its flawless design. He slid behind the wheel, his gloved hands gripping the steering wheel as if he had been born to drive it. With a final glance at each other, the trio revved the engines and prepared to make their escape. The glass doors of the dealership opened silently, and the three luxury vehicles rolled out into the night, their departure as smooth and effortless as their entry had been. As they sped through the city streets, the leader felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the culmination of months of planning and preparation. They had just pulled off one of the most daring heists in recent memory, and the best part was no one even knew it had happened. Not yet anyway. But as they disappeared into the night, each of them knew that the real challenge was still ahead. They had the cars, but now they had to make them disappear, to turn them into cold, hard cash without leaving a trace. And in a city like Charlotte, where everyone was watching and no one could be trusted, that was easier said than done. Chapter 2. The Mastermind. The leader of the group, known only as Vincent to his closest associates, was not a man easily rattled. In his late 30s, Vincent had spent most of his life in the shadows, operating on the fringes of society where the law was more of a suggestion than a rule. He was a man of contradictions, charming yet ruthless, calculating yet impulsive, and always one step ahead of everyone else. Vincent's path to becoming the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated car theft rings in the Southeast had been anything but straightforward. Born into a working-class family in the rough neighborhoods of New York City, he had learned early on that the world was not a fair place. While others followed the straight and narrow, Vincent found himself drawn to the thrill of the hustle. By the time he was a teenager, he had already built a reputation as someone who could get things done, no matter how risky or illegal they might be. His first big score came when he was just 19. A local crime boss had hired him to steal a shipment of high-end electronics from a warehouse in Queens. It was a job that would have intimidated most seasoned criminals, but Vincent executed it with precision, outsmarting the guards and bypassing the security systems with ease. The success of that job earned him respect in the criminal underworld and set him on a path that would eventually lead him to Charlotte. By the time Vincent arrived in Charlotte, he had evolved from a petty thief into a criminal entrepreneur. He recognized the city as a place of opportunity, a growing metropolis with wealth to spare and enough blind spots to make his line of work feasible. But unlike the smaller jobs he had pulled in New York, Vincent had bigger ambitions for Charlotte. He wanted to create an empire, and for that he needed a crew. Over the years, Vincent had assembled a team of specialists, each with their own unique skills. There was Curtis, the wiry tech expert who could hack into anything with a microchip. Jake, the muscle who could break into any place and handle any problem that required brute force. And finally, there was Mia, a sharp-witted woman who served as their eyes and ears on the ground, gathering intelligence and identifying targets. Together, they had pulled off numerous heists, each one more ambitious than the last. But the Highline Motors job was different. It wasn't just about the money. It was about making a statement. Vincent wanted to show everyone, both his rivals and the authorities, that he was untouchable. Stealing 3 luxury cars in a single night from one of the most secure dealerships in the city was the kind of bold move that would cement his reputation for years to come. As Vincent and his crew drove the stolen cars to a secure location on the outskirts of the city, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The job had gone off without a hitch, and now all that was left was to unload the cars and split the profits. But Vincent knew better than to let his guard down. In his line of work, complacency was a death sentence. There were still loose ends to tie up, and he was determined to see the job through to the end. They arrived at an abandoned warehouse, a relic of Charlotte's industrial past that had been repurposed for less than legal activities. The place was a fortress, surrounded by high fences and watched over by a network of security cameras. It was here that Vincent's crew would store the stolen vehicles until they could be stripped for parts or shipped overseas to be sold on the black market. Curtis and Jake parked the BMW and Mercedes inside the warehouse, while Vincent maneuvered the Porsche into place. As the engines died down, the silence that followed was almost eerie. The adrenaline of the heist had worn off, replaced by the cold reality of what they had just done. Mia was already there, waiting for them. She was a petite woman in her early 30s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude. Despite her small stature, she commanded respect from the others, a result of her keen intellect and her ability to think on her feet. "Well," she asked, her eyes scanning the cars with a critical eye. "Smooth as butter," Vincent replied, stepping out of the Porsche. "We're in the clear. No alarms, no witnesses, no trouble." Mia nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "Let's hope it stays that way. I've been hearing some chatter. People are starting to notice that cars have been disappearing, and it won't be long before the cops start putting the pieces together." Vincent shrugged, unfazed. "Let them look. By the time they figure out what happened, these cars will be halfway across the world." Curtis and Jake joined them, the former looking pleased with himself, the latter as stoic as ever. "So, what's the next move, boss?" Jake asked, his deep voice resonating through the warehouse. Vincent considered the question for a moment. "We split the cars up. Curtis, I want you to handle the BMW. Get it prepped for shipment to Europe. Jake, take the Mercedes down to Miami. I've got a buyer lined up who's willing to pay top dollar. I'll deal with the Porsche myself." "And what about me?" Mia asked, crossing her arms. "You stay here and keep an eye on things," Vincent replied. "We'll need to lay low for a while, and I want you to monitor the situation. If the cops start sniffing around, I want to know about it." Mia didn't argue, but there was a hint of tension in her expression. She trusted Vincent, but she also knew that the stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move, and they could all end up behind bars, or worse. As the crew went their separate ways to carry out their tasks, Vincent lingered in the warehouse, his mind racing with possibilities. The Highline Motors job had been a success, but it was just the beginning. There were bigger scores out there, and he was already planning his next move. But as he stood alone in the darkened warehouse, surrounded by the fruits of his labor, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had always prided himself on being 2 steps ahead, but now there was a nagging sense of unease in the back of his mind, a feeling that, for the first time in his career, he might have underestimated the risks. Vincent dismissed the thought as paranoia. After all, he was Vincent, the mastermind, the man who never lost. And as long as he stayed focused and kept his crew in line, there was no reason why this job would be any different. But deep down, he knew that the stakes had never been higher. And in the world he had chosen to inhabit, one misstep could be the difference between victory and disaster. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. The sun was just beginning to rise over Charlotte when the first phone call came in. It was a routine check-in from the security company that monitored Highline Motors, but the voice on the other end of the line was anything but routine. There was a sense of urgency in the dispatcher's tone, a realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Detective Laura Harris was sipping her first cup of coffee when she got the call from the station. As one of the leading detectives in the Charlotte Police Department's Auto Theft Division, she was used to early mornings and late nights, but something about this case felt different. She could hear it in the voice of the officer who briefed her. There was more to this than just another stolen car. Harris was in her early 40s, with short-cropped blonde hair and a no-nonsense attitude that had earned her the respect of her colleagues. She had been with the department for nearly 2 decades, and in that time, she had seen it all. Everything from joyriding teenagers to sophisticated car theft rings. But this was something new. She arrived at Highline Motors just as the sun was casting its first light on the city. The scene was already swarming with officers, and the dealership's manager, a nervous man in his 50s, was pacing back and forth, talking frantically into his phone. "Detective Harris," an officer greeted her as she stepped out of her car. "We got a situation here." "So I've heard," Harris replied, her eyes scanning the dealership. "Walk me through it." The officer, a young man with a fresh face, led her inside the showroom. "We got the call from the security company about an hour ago. They noticed that the security system had been tampered with, but by the time they sent someone to check it out, the cars were already gone." Harris frowned. "How many cars?" "3. A BMW, a Mercedes, and a Porsche. All high-end models, brand new." The showroom was a mess. Signs of a hurried search by the dealership staff, who had clearly tried to assess the damage before the police arrived. But Harris was more interested in the security system. "Show me the panel," she said. The officer led her to a small room at the back of the dealership, where the security panel was located. It was a state-of-the-art system, designed to be impenetrable, but someone had clearly found a way around it. The panel had been opened, wires carefully cut and spliced, and an electronic device still dangled from one of the ports. "Looks like they knew exactly what they were doing," the officer remarked. Harris nodded. This wasn't a smash and grab. These guys were professionals. She examined the device hanging from the panel, a small black box with wires protruding from it. "Get this down to the lab," she instructed. "I want to know what we're dealing with." The officer nodded and carefully removed the device, placing it in an evidence bag. Harris continued her inspection of the dealership, her mind racing as she pieced together what had happened. The thieves had bypassed the security system with surgical precision, taken exactly the cars they wanted, and disappeared without leaving a trace. It was the kind of job that required planning, coordination, and a deep understanding of both the technology and the layout of the dealership. As she returned to the showroom, the dealership's manager approached her, still looking flustered. "Detective, you have to find those cars," he pleaded. "Do you have any idea how much they're worth?" Harris gave him a reassuring nod. "We're doing everything we can, sir. I'll need a list of all your employees, anyone who had access to the dealership after hours, and the names of any recent customers who've shown interest in the cars that were taken." The manager hurried off to gather the information, and Harris turned her attention back to the scene. She knew that the first 24 hours were critical in a case like this. Every minute that passed made it harder to recover the stolen vehicles and catch the thieves. But there was something else nagging at her. This job had been too clean, too precise. It reminded her of cases she had worked on in the past, cases involving organized crime syndicates that specialized in high-end car thefts. If that was what they were dealing with here, this was just the tip of the iceberg. As Harris continued her investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple theft. The stakes were higher, the players more dangerous, and the consequences more severe. And as she delved deeper into the case, she would soon discover that the thieves weren't the only ones with something to hide. Chapter 4. The Crew Under Pressure. Back at the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense. Curtis was hunched over the laptop, furiously typing as he worked to erase any trace of their presence from the BMW's onboard computer system. Jake was pacing back and forth, his fists clenched, while Mia kept watch, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of trouble. Vincent stood apart from the group, his mind racing as he considered their next move. The heist had gone off without a hitch, but he knew that the real danger was only just beginning. The police would be all over this, and it was only a matter of time before they started closing in. "We need to move faster," Vincent said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Curtis, how much longer?" "Just a few more minutes," Curtis replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'm almost done wiping the system." Jake scowled. "We should have just stripped the cars for parts and been done with it. This is taking too long." Vincent shot him a sharp look. "And leave half the money on the table? No chance. We're doing this right." Mia glanced at Vincent, her expression unreadable. "What if the cops are already onto us? We can't afford to get sloppy now." "We're not getting sloppy," Vincent replied firmly. "We stick to the plan." Curtis finishes wiping the system. Jake takes the Mercedes to Miami, and I'll handle the Porsche. We've done this before, and we'll do it again. But despite his confident words, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to spiral out of control. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay ahead of the game, but now it felt like the game was changing, and he wasn't sure if he could keep up. As Curtis finished his work, the laptop beeped, signaling that the system wipe was complete. "All done," he said, sounding relieved. "This car is as clean as a whistle. No one will be able to trace it back to us." Vincent nodded. "Good. Let's get moving." Curtis and Jake loaded the laptop and tools back into their bags, while Vincent climbed into the Porsche, the engine purring to life beneath him. He glanced at the others, giving them a final nod. "Stay sharp," he said. "We'll meet back here in a few days to split the profits." As the crew dispersed, Vincent couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. He had always been able to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that something was wrong. But there was no turning back now. Their only option was to push forward and hope that their luck held out. Vincent guided the Porsche out of the warehouse and onto the road, the city lights blurring past him as he accelerated. The car was a masterpiece of engineering, its power and precision unmatched, but Vincent's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. As he drove, Vincent's thoughts turned to the future. He had always known that his life was a dangerous one, but he had accepted that risk in exchange for the rewards. But now, for the first time, he was starting to wonder if the rewards were worth it. The money, the power, the thrill of the heist, they had all come at a cost, and that cost was starting to weigh on him. Vincent shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He couldn't afford to think like that. Not now, not when they were so close to pulling off their biggest score yet. But as he sped through the city streets, he couldn't escape the feeling that his luck was running out. Chapter 5. Closing in. Detective Harris was back at the station, reviewing the evidence they had gathered so far. The security footage from Highline Motors had been a dead end. The thieves had been careful to avoid the cameras, and what little footage they did have was too grainy to make any positive identifications. But the device they had found at the scene was another story. The lab had managed to trace the components back to a supplier who specialized in high-tech gadgets used by hackers and cybercriminals. It was a small lead, but it was something. Harris leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk as she considered her next move. The pieces were starting to come together, but they were still missing something. Something that would tie it all together and lead them to the people responsible. She glanced at the clock. It was late, and most of the other detectives had already gone home for the night. But Harris wasn't ready to call it quits just yet. She picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. "Hey, it's Harris," she said when the line connected. "I need a favor." The person on the other end of the line, a contact in the city's underground, listened as Harris explained what she was looking for. "I'm hearing rumors about a new crew in town. People who know their way around a high-end car," she said. "Anything you can dig up on that?" There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You don't ask for much, do you? I'll see what I can find, but it's going to cost you." Harris sighed. "I'll make it worth your while. Just get me something I can use." As she hung up the phone, Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. The clock was ticking, and every minute that passed made it harder to recover the stolen cars. But she wasn't about to give up. She had a reputation for being relentless, and she wasn't going to let this case slip through her fingers. Meanwhile, Vincent was dealing with his own problems. The Porsche had been delivered to a buyer in Atlanta, but the transaction had not gone as smoothly as he had hoped. The buyer, a slick businessman with a reputation for being difficult, had tried to lowball him on the price, and Vincent had been forced to negotiate harder than usual to get what he was owed. As he drove back to Charlotte, Vincent's mind was racing. The buyer's attitude had been a reminder of just how precarious his position was. He was operating in a world where trust was a rare commodity, and even the smallest misstep could be fatal. Vincent's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was Mia. "What's up?" he asked as he answered the call. "We got a problem," Mia said, her voice tense. "I've been hearing things. People are asking questions, trying to find out who pulled the Highline Motors job. It's only a matter of time before someone connects the dots." Vincent cursed under his breath. "Who's asking?" "Cops mostly. But there's also talk on the street. Someone's trying to smoke us out." Vincent gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind racing. "Okay, we need to lay low for a while, let things cool down." "What about the money?" Mia asked. "We'll deal with that later. Right now, we need to stay out of sight." Mia didn't argue, but Vincent could hear the concern in her voice. "Be careful, Vincent. I don't like where this is heading." "Neither do I," Vincent admitted. "But we'll get through it. We always do." As he hung up the phone, Vincent felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The walls were closing in, and he knew that he was running out of time. But Vincent was a survivor, and he wasn't about to go down without a fight. Chapter 6, The Final Move. The days that followed were tense. Vincent and his crew kept a low profile, staying out of sight and avoiding any unnecessary risks. But despite their efforts, the pressure was mounting. The police were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before someone made a mistake. Vincent knew that they needed to act fast if they were going to salvage the situation. He called a meeting at the warehouse, where the atmosphere was thick with tension. "We need to wrap this up," Vincent said, getting straight to the point. "We've got the money from the Porsche, but we still need to unload the other two cars. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets." Curtis nodded, though he looked nervous. "I've got a buyer lined up for the BMW, but he's asking questions. Wants to know where the car came from. I told him it's better if he doesn't ask, but he's not the type to back down." Jake, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "And the Mercedes? It's still sitting in Miami. My contact down there says it's getting too hot. Cops are all over the place, and he's not willing to take the risk." Vincent cursed under his breath. "We're running out of options." Mia, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Maybe it's time to cut our losses. We've got enough to disappear for a while. Lay low until this all blows over." Vincent shook his head. "We can't just walk away. We need to finish this." But even as he said the words, Vincent knew that Mia was right. They were in over their heads, and the longer they stayed in the game, the more dangerous it became. As the crew debated their next move, Vincent's phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening as he read the words. "What is it?" Mia asked, sensing the change in his demeanor. "It's from my contact in Atlanta," Vincent said, his voice tight. "The buyer who took the Porsche, he's dead. Found in his office this morning, shot in the head." The room fell silent, the implications of the news sinking in. If the buyer had been killed, it meant that someone was cleaning up loose ends, and they could be next. "We're pulling out," Vincent said, his decision made. Curtis, cancel the deal for the BMW. Jake, I want you to get rid of the Mercedes, no questions asked. Mia, you and I are going to disappear for a while. We'll regroup when things cool down. There was no argument, no discussion. The crew knew that Vincent was right. The game was over, and it was time to cut their losses before it was too late. As they left the warehouse for the last time, Vincent couldn't help but feel a sense of defeat. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who called the shots. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was being hunted. Vincent and Mia drove through the city in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The thrill of the heist had faded, replaced by a cold, hard reality. They had come so close to pulling off the perfect job, but in the end, it had all fallen apart. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Vincent glanced at Mia, who was staring out the window, her expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Mia turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "No," she said after a moment, "but I'm ready to move on." Vincent nodded, understanding what she meant. The life they had chosen was a dangerous one, filled with risks and uncertainties. But it was also a life that had given them more than they had ever imagined. Now, though, it was time to leave it behind. They drove on, leaving the city and their past behind them. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to face it together. Epilogue. Detective Harris stood outside the abandoned warehouse, watching as the crime scene investigators combed through the area. It had taken weeks of relentless work, but they had finally tracked down the stolen vehicles, or at least what was left of them. The BMW had been found in a chop shop on the outskirts of the city, stripped for parts and unrecognizable. The Mercedes had been abandoned in Miami, left to gather dust in a rundown garage. And the Porsche, well, the Porsche had been a dead end, the trail going cold after it had been sold to an unknown buyer in Atlanta. But while the case had not ended the way she had hoped, Harris knew that they had made progress. The crew behind the heist had disappeared, but she was confident that it was only a matter of time before they resurfaced. And when they did, she would be ready. As she left the warehouse and walked to her car, Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The job wasn't done, but they were getting closer. And in the world of law enforcement, sometimes that was the best you could hope for. As she drove away, the city stretched out before her, a maze of streets and secrets waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere out there, the thieves who had pulled off the Highline Motors heist were still at large, their fates uncertain. But Detective Harris wasn't worried. She knew that in the end, justice would prevail. It always did.